If you think about what somebody is trying to do when they provide you an argument, what they're trying to do is convince you of a position, or they're trying to establish something to be the case, or they're trying to prove a point, however you want to cash it out. But what they're trying to prove, we call that the conclusion. And the information that they provide you as evidence for the conclusion, we call those the premises. Maybe there's one premise, maybe there's two premises, 3, 4, so on and so forth. So the idea then, somebody coming up and giving an argument, the idea then is there's something between the information that's contained in the premises and the conclusion, such that if you accept the premises, then you ought to accept the conclusion. Right? There's supposed to be this link there. Could represent that link by that line that's going from the premises to the conclusion. So there remains a question, though, of whether that link in that yellow circle really is there. Is it really the case that there is something about the information in those premises that leads to the conclusion? And that's what the concept of validity is trying to get at. So for deductive arguments, this link in the yellow circle, what somebody is trying to say is, if the information I'm really giving you is true, there's no way for the conclusion to be false. And that's the reason why you should accept it to be true. It would be irrational to accept the premises that if it guaranteed that the conclusion had to be true, yet you think the conclusion is false. That's irrational. You're engaging in something that's irrational. So a valid argument, then, that is good in that sense, when we're only worried about the link that's in that yellow circle, a valid argument, then, is one that if the premises are true, then the conclusion must be true. So notice the if. I circled the if with red because when we're assessing validity, we're not yet worried about whether the premises are true or whether they're false. We're not worried about that yet. Okay? What we're worried about is if they turned out to be true, and now this is why I circled the must, would it be the case that there's no way for the conclusion to be false? So we're not even yet worried about whether the conclusion is true or false. We're worried about whether, if these premises are true, it would make it such that there's no way for the conclusion to be false. That is to say, it must be true. So there is another textbook definition of validity. It says the same thing, but put in different words, and that you might find that useful. So another way of thinking about a valid argument is one that it is impossible, there is no way, for both of these things to take place. So both of these things. One, its premises are true, and its conclusion is false. If it's impossible for both of those things to happen at the same time of an argument, then you have yourself a valid argument. All right, so let's look at some examples so we can get a better understanding of this idea, this concept of validity. In this argument, our premise says that France is in the northern hemisphere, and that is the evidence being given to believe that the Eiffel Tower is in France. Now notice that it really is the case, so it really is in fact true that France is in the northern hemisphere. And it really is true that the Eiffel Tower is in France. But remember, we're not worried about whether our premises or our conclusions are true when assessing validity. In assessing validity, we want to know whether the information that is contained in the premise really does say that we ought to accept the conclusion. But in this case, we can tell that the argument is invalid. Why? Well, there really was a time in which France is in the northern hemisphere and the Eiffel Tower wasn't in France because there was a time in which the Eiffel Tower didn't exist. So it's possible for the premise to be true and the conclusion false. So now we're not worried about whether the premise is actually true. I'm just pointing out that, hey, it could be the case, given all the information that this argument provides us, it could be the case that the premise is true and the conclusion is false. And clearly, we don't want to be convinced by an argument that, despite all the information you're given, the position that somebody's trying to convince you of could still be false. So this ends up being an invalid argument. Even though the premise is actually true and the conclusion is actually true. Let's look at another argument. All right, in this argument, our two premises say the following things. If the grass is green, then the moon is made of blue cheese. The grass is green. And then the conclusion is the moon is made of blue cheese. So notice in this case that premise 1 is actually false. It's false because at the time of recording this, the grass really is green, but the moon really is not made of blue cheese. So it does turn out, though, that our second premise is true. And it turns out that our conclusion is false. But remember, when we're assessing validity, we're not yet worried about whether our premises are in fact true or whether they're in fact false. The question is if the premises are true. So if we pretend for the moment as though that they are true, would there be any way for the conclusion to be false? And in this case, there isn't a way for the conclusion to be false. That is, the conclusion would have to be true. Why? Because premise 1 states that the grass being green guarantees that the moon is made of blue cheese. That's what it asserts to be true. That grass being green guarantees the moon is made of blue cheese. And premise 2 says that the grass really is green. So if the grass being green guarantees the moon is made of blue cheese and the grass is in fact green, then there is no way for it to be false that the moon is made of blue cheese. That is, it must be true that the moon is made of blue cheese, and this property holds of this argument. It holds of the argument even though the conclusion is false and even though one of its premises is false. So you might be thinking it's weird that the previous argument was a valid argument. Why? Well, validity has something to do with whether the argument is a good argument, but the previous argument had a false premise and a false conclusion. And of course, we don't want to be accepting of an argument that's going to lead us to a false conclusion. But what you need to remember is that validity really is concerned just with this component of an argument. Just whether the information that is contained in the premises really does lead to the conclusion. So somebody gives you an argument and they're saying, hey, this information supports the conclusion, but maybe they're wrong about that. And validity is assessing that aspect. Luckily, to address your concern, we have the concept of soundness. And soundness builds off of the concept of validity. In fact, you'll notice that in part of the definition of a sound argument, it's got to be a valid argument. That's what I mean by saying that it builds off of validity. So it captures one aspect in which an argument can be a good argument, but then it builds off because not only are we now worried about whether the conclusion really follows from the premises, but now we're worried about whether the premises really are true. So for a sound argument, it's got to have two properties, and it's got to have both of these. All of its premises need to be true, and it needs to be a valid argument. So let's look at a few more examples of arguments that imply the concept of soundness to them. All right, so this argument says that Socrates was mortal. All humans are mortal. Therefore, Socrates was a human. Now, it turns out that the first premise really is true because the person that Socrates denotes was in fact mortal. And it really turns out that all humans are mortal, unfortunately for us, I suppose. And it turns out that Socrates really was a human. So based on that, you might be tempted to think that it's a sound argument because all of its premises are true, and its conclusion happens to be true as well. However, it turns out in this case, it's not a valid argument. Why not? Well, if all we're relying on is the information that the argument gives us, all we know is that Socrates was mortal, and all we know is that all humans are mortal. But we don't know what kind of entity Socrates is. This argument doesn't tell us what sort of entity Socrates is. So given this argument, for all we know, it could be that Socrates is a raccoon. If Socrates is a raccoon, then notice that it still is true that Socrates was mortal, because raccoons are mortal. It really is true that all humans are mortal, because even if Socrates is a raccoon, humans are still mortal. But it'll turn out that it's false that Socrates was a human. So you might have thought that the evidence given here in the premises really supports the conclusion, but it doesn't. It's an invalid argument. And since it's an invalid argument, it's got to be an unsound argument. Right, this argument says that if Obama is the president, then the president is a Democrat. Obama is the president. Therefore, the president is a Democrat. Unlike our previous argument, this is a valid argument. It's a valid argument because the first premise says that Obama being the president guarantees that the president is a Democrat. And it says that Obama is the president. Well, if Obama being the president actually guarantees that the president is a Democrat, and Obama is really the president, then there's no way that the president isn't a Democrat. So it is a valid argument. But that doesn't make it sound. Because even though it's a valid argument, in order to be a sound argument, it also has to have all of its premises to be true. But, of course, not all of its premises are true, because it turns out Obama is not the president of the United States. He hasn't been for a while now. Thus, like the previous argument, this is an unsound argument. All right, let's look at one more argument. This argument is going to remind you not of the last argument, but the one before that. However, it's been changed a little bit. It says that all humans are mortal. Socrates was human. Therefore, Socrates was mortal. Okay, is this a sound argument? It turns out that all of its premises are in fact true. All humans really are mortal. Again, unfortunately for us, I suppose. Socrates really was a human. But now the question is whether it's a valid argument. Well, if everything that is a human is immortal, and Socrates is one of those humans, then there's no escaping for Socrates to be mortal. So Socrates really will have to be mortal if it's true that all humans are mortal and Socrates was human. Therefore, it is a valid argument. Because all of its premises are true and it's a valid argument, there's no way for its conclusion to be false, so its conclusion has to be true as well. But since both of these components here have been met, it is a sound argument. All right, that ends the lecture on validity and soundness. I hope it proved useful to you.